All right, happy day. I am, of course, starting the webinar just a minute or two early per usual because I always want to make sure my audio is good. So whoever the first one on here is, and they want to tell me, can you hear me? And let me know, oh, yay, Patsy, that they can hear me because I've had a struggle time or two with people being able to hear me on these webinars. So thank you. I'm glad you can hear me. Apparently I was talking one time for 5 minutes before anybody wanted to speak up to let me know that it was just my mouth moving. So you know what, I really love this webinar ninjas, what the software is called, because I can interact with people. And I don't know how many of you that are on this have been to one of our live workshops or been on a webinar before, but I'm a people person and I love to interact with people and hear their stories and just I can hear you. Thank you, Beth. I love to meet people and hear about some of their struggles that they're having, maybe the story of their child, what's going on, where some of their concerns are, and be able to help them out that way. And of course, we're on a webinar online, so I can't do that, and I can't meet you unless you come into the office, of course, at some point, but I want to be able to help you guys out individually as well. So if there's something in particular, a burning question or concern that you have that you're hoping to hear about tonight, put that in the chat box as well. That way I can at least address it at the end and or while I'm talking, that we can talk about it and make sure, once again, that you're heard. I love to be able to help families. I'm going to share a little bit of my son's story through here and how I got to this path and down this path, and to the parent that I've become, the challenges we've been through. And really it was through, of course, other doctors that have been doing this, but a lot of research on why things are going on with their child. Why won't they eat more than 5 things? I'll talk about that, Beth. Why might they be having meltdowns? Why might they be having problems transitioning, not focusing in school, not sleeping through the night, getting ill, constipated, crying all the time? And while your child may have all of those or one of those, honestly, I know we hear this all the time of it's just normal. Right? That's just normal behavior. They're going to outgrow it. It's just a phase. Just let's wait and see. And unfortunately, I hear that every single day in the office. As a parent, you're concerned about your child, you bring it up, and someone says, "Oh, my kid went through that, they're fine." Or you might go to a medical doctor or a counselor and they say, "Oh, this is just normal." Well, we've normalized a lot of very common conditions because they're happening so often. And I seriously hadn't really taken in consideration quite at all the whole body approach to things, and looking at things from basically the inside out, instead of hyper focusing on just a behavior, hyper focusing on sleeping, on potty training, on eating. And we just kind of want to pull each one of those systems out and evaluate it and address that concern, instead of looking at the person, looking at the child, and figuring out, okay, why might they be struggling with these sorts of things? And rather than me providing a tip for you to cover up a symptom, we're going to take a kind of a broad spectrum view before we hone in on really how the body works. And that's really what I had to do for my son as well. I know that I tell people when they come to my classes, sometimes we call them workshops, and I say there's very little work to do here, although you might be a note taker. And I don't have any sort of tricks, tips, tools to cover up a symptom. It's more about finding out why that is there in the first place. I know people have all sorts of suggestions when you might say, my child has black rings under their eyes, or they have problems sleeping, and they're like, oh, just, throw some lavender in the diffuser. They're probably having problems sleeping. Well, that's great, but my child doesn't have a lack of lavender in their system, right? And I'm the first person to say I love essential oils. I've got a diffuser going in the background. You can probably see. I love it as part of a whole, but to understand how the body works is really where I had to go, and just to even step back, because I got to this point in his life where there were so many things adding up that it had pushed slowly so far outside of my values and what I had envisioned for him, that I don't know if I had clear boundaries at that time, or we kind of had to reverse back and say, okay, what are our family's boundaries? Where are our values? What's going on? How are we going to solve problems, how conflict, what foods are acceptable in our home, what's bedtime look like, what's our morning routine look like, and really make sure that the kids are part of that and interactive in that. That way we can take control and be empowered over our health, both emotionally and physically. I think right now is a really good time that we just kind of sit back, as we've all been together as a family over the last 3 months, quarantined, but looking a little deeper on, we need to be proactive about our health instead of reactive. We need to be a really solid, healthy person so that we're not concerned later on what's going on in this world. And I know that we've talked about this in other videos and other webinars that we've done of how to be proactive rather than really reactive, and make sure you're strong. You've got a strong body, you're a strong host, and you can fight those things off. And we're going to talk a little bit about the immune system as well. But really, when you figure out, okay, this is my family's values and our boundaries, and we're way outside of it, what are you going to do about it, right? What changes are you going to make? How are you going to go about making those changes? Are you just going to address one thing at a time? Or are you going to look at the bigger picture? And that's really where we had to go, because I'm a researcher. I loved school. I seriously was like, I wanted to know more and about why and what's going on. So when I got to this point with my son of all of his struggles he was having, I read tons of books. I took parenting classes because I'm thinking that it was a parenting issue, because I didn't have this with my older son. I'm thinking that, okay, he also was getting croup often. He wasn't sleeping through the night. I'm trying to figure out, like, do we need to sleep train him? Do we need to potty train him in a different way than his brother did? And really, when I got down to it, I had to look at what was going on with his brain. And that's what we talk about in our office a lot. This is my favorite poster. I have a picture of it on my wall in my office as well. But when I really heard this information and started to let it sink in and understand, okay, yes, we know that the brain controls everything. We know people's brains work differently. We know that the brain is in charge of not only every internal system, but every external thing that you see. And when someone said you live your life through your nervous system, I had to think back and say, okay, yes, the brain gets feedback from the nervous system. All right, wow, what's going on here? Because everything you think, say, do, taste, smell, touch has to be processed through that nervous system. And why might we all be sitting here possibly listening to this webinar and feel different thoughts, feel different feelings? Why might you be in a room with your child who is having a complete meltdown over something that you feel like is seemingly normal? And why might, like I'm saying, people watching this video, someone might feel stressed, someone might feel excited. Your slides, our tiny thumbnails in the corner. Okay, let me just see if I can pop this up a little bit closer or change my layout. Whoa, that's really it. My face isn't on there right now, is it? Or I'm wondering, let's see. Can you see this one? Yes, yay. Okay, well, I'm just going to back up just a hot minute. That way, if you guys wanted to see some of these, you could take a look at normal versus common, which we've already kind of covered, and looking at a lot of what we hear in the office as, this is what my child's struggling with, and I may or may not have been heard about it. I just had a conversation today with a new patient when we were looking at what was going on with her son, and we reverse time a little bit. We want to look back and say, okay, when did this start? What's going on? What's happening? Talk to me about it. Give me your mom gut. Give me your intuition on what you feel is going on with your child. And, even concerns that had kind of been swept under the rug by other providers was, he's a sensory seeker. He loves to tackle and be rough and play, and but while also being very picky about the fabrics that are on his skin, and his socks must be perfect, and having, meltdowns that we didn't think were appropriate, and going into preschool, and every teacher tells me he has an inability to focus. Listening to that story from a mom and looking at what's going on in their life gives me an idea of, here's where the stress is in the nervous system. Here's what we're going to be able to evaluate, not only in our office, but neurologically on the scans with some objective data. But it's so important that you as a parent are being heard, and that your concerns are being addressed, instead of saying, oh, well, that's just how it is, or they're in a phase, or they're going to outgrow it. Because in our humble opinion, we see kids grow into something else. I'm going to follow that up with a couple slides here in a minute. This quote that Dr. Bruce Lipton, and if you guys follow him, he's fantastic. Look him up. He writes The Biology of Belief, and he's highly awarded for stem cell research as well as epigenetics, and figuring out that a lot of the gene conversation is more the environment that was turning those genes on. But he says that the function of the nervous system is to perceive the environment and coordinate the behavior of all other cells. So our brain is getting that information from the nervous system. The nervous system's picking up on everything that's going on around us, both internally and externally. And it's got to take in all that information through all the senses, process it, and spit it back out. What we often see is the spit back out, right? The behavior that we don't appreciate, whether it's unable to eat certain foods, whether it's not being able to sleep through the night, whether it's meltdowns, inability to focus. That behavior is typically what we're looking at. And something we need to understand is that the input from that nervous system is going to equal the output. And that output is the noticeable part, but very few times are we ever measuring the input to say, okay, why is the brain getting these sort of stress signals and reacting the way that it is? And it really breaks down to a couple different components of it and what's going on. We're going to talk about the why here in a moment, when we need to talk about how that nervous system works. And a lot of people that have jumped on these webinars before, come to my classes, know all about the fight or flight response. They hear about this all the time: fight, flight, freeze. That is your sympathetic nervous system. That's the nervous system side that is turned on when you feel stressed, when something is a threat. And once again, this is all subjective, right? You might feel threatened right now, or someone else is feeling happy. But that's when that threat is triggered, your sympathetic nervous system turns on. And that is an innate response that says, I'm under attack, I need to survive. And while that's on, you see other systems being turned down, like immune and digestive tract. You also see your senses being turned up, because you have to be ready to fight or flee from whatever enemy is there in front of you, whatever threat is there in front of you. And we often give an analogy called flip your lid. And if you guys have probably seen me do this before, where we say, let me just see if I can get myself big and I can show you this example. When we talk about flipping your lid, that's when the sympathetic nervous system's in control and engaged. And that's your hindbrain. You've got a forebrain that's in control of rational, organized, creative thought. That prefrontal cortex is still developing throughout childhood and even into, for men, 25, 26, 27, 8 years old. But this fight or flight response that's triggered, this is your amygdala. This is the reactive and impulsive side of your nervous system. This is that survival side of your nervous system. And this is the one that's going to get the heart rate up, the blood flow pumping. It's going to shunt the blood from those internal organs out to the limbs to fight or flee. And often, if you are in survival, if you're running from a bear, your body doesn't necessarily care if there's a virus in the air. It doesn't necessarily care that there is a nice big cheeseburger in your stomach that needs to be digested. It doesn't care if it has to go to the bathroom. There's a lot of things it doesn't care about when it needs to be in survival. Fortunately or unfortunately for some people, that system should be short-lived and shut down. There's a time when that system starts running the show and we start getting hardwired for stress, where we call it a loose lid, where things are going to be trip our trigger a lot easier than other people. And you can usually tell when someone's kind of got a loose lid, they're a little uptight, they don't adapt to stress very well. They're kind of those type A real controlling people. And they have a hard time letting in any sort of stress and being able to process it very well. And we see that with kids. A lot of people say, well, my kid is very controlling. Yeah, it tends to get to that point when they aren't able to process their environment appropriately. I'm going to try to get my face back on here in a minute because I end up, there we go. Kidding, clicking too many buttons, I think sometimes. What feeds that fight or flight response is 3 different forms of stress. So when your body's perceiving something as stress and you are now feeding the cycle of stress, you're going to see physical, chemical, and emotional stress cause interference, irritation, and inflammation inside of the body. The chiropractors call these the 3 T's: thoughts, traumas, and toxins. And I often say if I could add another T to that, it would be technology. And it honestly covers all 3 of these things. There's emotional stress typically with technology, there's a chemical stress, and there is a physical stress, and that's usually not moving their body enough. Most people think of physical stress as, falling out of their tree house, but instead it can also be playing video games for 6 hours, watching movies all day long. And there's often people that will sit down and have a conversation with us and say, okay, my kid can't watch television or it's going to be a nightmare the following day, or they can't have red food, dye, or sugar, it's going to be a nightmare, or this is an emotional stress for them in a social environment or school when somebody else isn't. Well, typically that's because they already have stress inside of the system and those things are feeding it. I'm not saying it's not good to remove those other stressors. Of course it is. We tell people all the time, get a clean environment, choose your stress wisely. But that big red circle in the middle that says subluxation, that is a word that chiropractors use for stress that's been stuck inside of the nervous system. And these 3 things will feed that stress, because there is a time when we will also sit down and talk to people that say, we have a loving, caring environment. We eat all organic food. We don't have any toxins in the home. We are outside exercising, and this child is still really struggling with these emotional components, with meltdowns, with transitions, with focusing. And we have to really back up and say, all right, where are these stresses coming from? You aren't feeding the stress, but it's still there. And we still need to be able to address that underlying stress component, and it can be measured on our neurological scans. I wanted to pop this picture up because the reverse of the fight or flight response is the parasympathetic. That's your brake pedal. If the sympathetic fight or flight's your gas, the parasympathetic is your brake pedal. That is where the healing, resting, growth, development, digestion occurs. That side of your nervous system and it can't be on at the same time as your sympathetic nervous system. So those 2 are inversely proportional. But your parasympathetic nervous system is something that's engaged at night while you're sleeping. That's why infants and children require so much more rest than adults do. We still require rest to heal and repair from the stress of the day, but kids are also growing and developing very, very rapidly. And when that sympathetic nervous system is engaged, when we've got that lid that's loose and flipped, we start missing out on the parasympathetic nervous system. And I don't know how clear you can see this, especially if you're watching it from a device, but when you're looking at this slide in particular, there's a side of the nervous system that's listed over here, parasympathetic, and it talks about all the controls. When you look at the reverse, the sympathetic, they're absolutely the opposite of the parasympathetic nervous system. And if you look at all of the controls throughout this nervous system and the spinal cord, you see all of these roots that are coming out. And for the sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system, you're going to notice that it's very attached to one area in the body, in the upper cervical spine, which we're going to examine, some in the brain, and then one down here in the lower part of your body, which is going to come into play here when we start talking a little bit more about why the stress might get stuck there. And then we measure it in our office. We want to know what kind of parasympathetic tone is the body holding, or sympathetic tone. So that's what this chart and the autonomic nervous system looks at, is a body at rest for 3 minutes feel as if it's in sympathetic, or does it even possibly feel as if it's in parasympathetic? this is a dot of a scan that we had taken on a child who is definitely at rest, stuck in sympathetic. He's also low in the autonomic nervous system activity, meaning he's missing out on digestion, on resting, on repairing, on his immune system functions. They can't run at 100% where they need to, or at least 80% where you'd be in the green box. Our bodies do really, really well at 80%. When they start feeling like they're chronically stressed and they have a loose lid, this is a kid with a lot of behavior issues and inability to focus, and came to our office because he was denied from a private preschool and kindergarten that the family really wanted him to be able to go to, but he wasn't able to be mature enough to sit still and self-regulate. And we're pretty firm believers that the body should be able to be healthy, to self-heal and self-regulate. So we needed to know for this child, where's the body at? Where is it not unable to regulate? What kind of parasympathetic or sympathetic tone is the body stuck in? Because that's going to give us the best picture of here's a game plan moving forward. A lot of people wonder, if you've heard of our office before, you haven't, of how we determine the care plans or how we help kids get to the point of where they're at, experiencing a lot of symptoms and illness, to a point of healthy, vibrant child. And it's really the game plan in between, and it's monitoring their nervous system to watch and see how are they doing, what's going on. And we know through the research that every single chiropractic adjustment is actually putting that lid on tighter. It's stimulating the prefrontal cortex to engage and inhibit that fight or flight response so that the body can self-heal, so that the body can self-regulate, so that the parasympathetic nervous system can be on when it needs to, which is really, really important, as we know, in growth and development, and even in social interactions with a kid, to understand what's socially acceptable. If they're constantly stuck in a state of fight or flight, they're just in survival. They are just in tunnel vision, and they don't have time to slow down, to look at social cues, to understand what's acceptable, to understand that I need to sit down and focus on the school or listen in class, or I shouldn't bite that child. I just wanted that car back. That's a child that's stuck in fight or flight. And what we don't want is them to start to become wired that way. From birth to 3, a child's making 1 million new neurological connections a second. What we don't want that to be is wired for stress, wired for destruction, wired to be angry, wired to have upset, and not be able to self-regulate. So it's a little bit of unwiring, and the older the child is, the longer that it's going to take to undo that wiring. But there's a new rehabituation process that needs to be undergone and followed through with and sought out. And that's something that we do in our office to be sure that that's what's going on internally inside of the body. I wanted to pull up, and if you guys are researchers like I am, I've got a lot more links at the end of any sort of research that you might want to look at. But when I look at this research study that was done in 2015, I know it's probably pretty grainy on your end. There was a bunch of people who weren't chiropractors, who were MDs, who were DOs, that wanted to look at not only the birth process, but look at what's going on in newborns after the birth process. And they found out that 99 out of 100, which is a tremendous amount, and this was even mind-blowing for me as a pediatric chiropractor, had some form of neurological interference, had a pattern of a subluxation. That's that big red circle you saw in the middle. To varying degrees, right? A little bit of interference and a lot of neurological interference. And the kids with a lot of neurological interference are usually the kids that translate to a lot of stress in their life, latching difficulties, ear infections, colic, reflux, the difficulty sleeping, the potty training issues, the focus issues. And this is often where we will start to sit down with a family and look and say, okay, let's figure out where the stress came from. And here's a common path that, because we've heard this story so many times, that we see. And the perfect storm is really just a term that we've coined when we find enough of those stressors to see that there is a symptomatology, a neurological compromise inside of a body that is exhibiting now a behavior that's something that is undesirable, right? Outside of our family's value, something that we would like to see changed. And sometimes we know how to go about it, and other times we don't. I hope I can help you, guide you into exploring the nervous system and the brain and how it's getting feedback and figuring out, is this where it's coming from? Because pulling out this other system didn't really work for us. I'd like to take the whole body approach and figure out what's going on neurologically with my child, and is the master control system under stress. So often that fight or flight response starts, I know you guys can read these slides, but it starts early on, sometimes even preconception, but during the pregnancy. I know with my son Landon, I had a lot of emotional stress with moving to a place I didn't know, starting a business in a recession, a new marriage. There was a lot going on. I even had a toddler at the time. Going on emotionally to me. And what I didn't know and didn't really think about at the time was that my baby was feeling everything I was feeling. He was getting my emotional bloodbath, my chemical bloodbath. And if I am in fight or flight, the baby's getting all of those hormones. He's getting my cortisol and my adrenaline, and he's feeling exactly what I'm feeling. And you get your mother's nervous system. So that is something that can really start triggering early and often. There's also some worry. I'd had a miscarriage just prior to that, and I had some worry about losing another pregnancy. So that is also an angst that I was putting through myself through, but also him. And once again, hindsight's 2020. I can look back and say, that's where some of it came from. But I often say that the windshield is bigger than the rear view mirror. Sometimes we got to check to see where we came from, but really that windshield is where we need to focus on where we're going, where we want to go, what is our goals, what's our directions, what's our family's values, and how do we want to take care of where the stress had come from. And often there's some birth intervention. I'm going to show you a video a little bit later here of a birth that I think is going to be really interesting for you guys to watch, because we don't really think about the stress of birth as being the first stress of our child. Or, especially a mom who's like, I didn't have any pregnancy challenges. I, had kale chips, did yoga and swam every day. I was feeling fantastic. But what happens from the uterus to the outside world really, really matters. And I had no idea until I became a pediatric chiropractor just how important that was, and that environment they came out into, including cord-wrapped births, forceps, vacuums, deliveries, cesarean sections. I even had one of those for my third child, and which is what we're going to watch here in a little bit. Just things that you don't really think about as being a stressor, but we'll see those babies be stressed and colicky. They might cry through the night. They might be having a hard time being consoled. They might need to be held all the time. Like, I can only stand and mouse this baby who's definitely stuck in fight or flight. They're stiff and they're rigid, and they're unable to digest their food. They're spitting up all the time. I wasn't able to make enough breast milk, and now the baby is on formula that we're now changing formulas for because we don't know what works with their body. This is stories that I hear often, and pretty soon they get their first tooth. There's extra mucus, they can't drain the ear tubes, they start getting ear infections. You might have been down the antibiotics or the ear tube route, sometimes even the tonsils, because they start getting sick as a child, the swollen adenoids, unable to sleep through the night. And all of a sudden, that hyperactive toddler, the terrible twos, turns into another year of the terrible threes. And that's really when I started to notice from my son where things started to escalate, when he was 3 years old and still not self-regulating, where I felt like, man, 3 is worse than 2. I don't understand why people are talking about these terrible 2s. He's still unable to focus and self-regulate. And we had to kind of prep him with like, oh, buddy, we're going to go to the grocery store. You have to stop playing with your cars, and be really gentle about those transitions, because that was fight or flight for him. He had that one-tracked brain that's all he could do at the moment he was doing it, and that's where his focus went. And there's other families that I see that attention is really split, and it's kind of everywhere. They can't focus on anything. They just bounce from one thing to the next and have attention span of a gnat. And that's usually when you start to see some kids with some sensory issues, with some food aversions, with sleeping through the night, with focusing in school when you're at number 5, where they are experiencing a lot more sensory issues than we're feeling comfortable with. And pretty soon we'll start to bring in the exhausted, angry, or anxious teen, which is where, as I was talking before, sometimes that neurological hardwiring is a lot harder to get undone than it is for a child who's 1, 2, 3, or 4, and even 5 years old. As the older they get, the more neurological habituation has been there that we need to re-habituate inside of the body. And then it also will translate into those 30-year-old mothers, 40-year-old mothers, or fathers as well, that are feeling burnt out, stressed out, and exhausted because they don't have any extra energy. They've expended all of their energy in fight or flight and feeling anxious and feel fearful, feeling worried, and the extra energy that should be there to be able to exercise, to be able to pour into loved ones, to be able to do, even work, jobs. They can't do it because they don't have anything extra. Your body only has so much energy to give. And when it's tired and run down, you're just not the best version of yourself. Of course, 1 through 7, no one's the best version of themselves, which is really where my heart is at. I want to see people living an elevated life. And when you start to follow people through this stress response, you're just not getting the best version of them. And that's really what the world needs from us. So I've got this video of a cesarean section, and I want to tell you it's not gory or bloody, and if you guys have a weak stomach by any means, but I just want you to watch these doctors who are very calm. This is a scheduled cesarean section. They're having fun with this C-section. They're not trying to harm this baby by any means, but I want you to watch it and just tell me how you think that this baby feels.
Oh, there you go, little fella.
Come on, buddy.
All righty. Ears of a girl.
I'm sucked out, wiped out. He's never seen the outside world.
Oh, he's mad. Keep coming back. He did good.
There you go.
All right.
Look at those big old testicles, though.
All right, I try to usually stop it prior to the big old testicles.
Yeah.
Well, you sure have a big head here.
Yeah,
Just gonna
that was the
finish here in a
problem.
second.
The head.
So could you guys see that? Because sometimes that video slows down for people. I want to make sure that you're able to get the full effect of that. I had a scheduled cesarean section. Yeah, pulling up by the head. Exactly, Patsy. I had a scheduled cesarean section. And I obviously wasn't behind the curtain. My husband was. That wasn't my son being born via C-section. It was another chiropractor's son that they had the video. But when you take a look at that, that there is no moment in time that you would ever let anybody handle your infant like that, let alone, that was terrifying, yeah. And you would never let anybody handle your infant like that. Any moment after the birth, and clearly, once again, those practitioners weren't trying to hurt that baby. That hurt that baby. Their intentions are good, but that is dangerous. And we know that if anybody did that to our baby post-birth, we would be freaking out, right? We'd be calling 911. We would not allow it. That's the most delicate part of the body. It's holding the brain. It has a spinal cord. It's so important that part of the body is safe and protected. So it ends up being a trauma to that baby. And like that research said, 99 of 100 infants have some form of neurological interference at birth. That baby obviously had a lot more than others. My son was a vaginal birth at home in a peaceful environment. However, he came really, really fast. And I just didn't look at that as being a trauma to him, which is also why his symptoms started showing up a little bit later. His neurological interference wasn't as great as a scheduled cesarean section. Man, that baby's born into fight or flight. If you can imagine just being all nestled up in your mom's belly or just asleep in bed and someone flips on the lights and yanks you out by your head or neck, you're freaking out. And unfortunately, there's some kids that have to be born that way. When there's an emergency, it doesn't even look that nice. It's pretty traumatic for those babies, and they're usually whisked off to NICU to save their lives. And unfortunately, those moms aren't going home with a list of this is what you should do about this procedure you just had. I had one. I had a list of these are the things you should do post C-section. I couldn't lift weights, like, a certain amount of weight or walk upstairs or drive the car, blah, blah, blah. My baby didn't have any directions. Nobody said this could have harmed him. This could be neurologically damaging to him. You should have this baby checked out by a safe, a gentle, and effective pediatric chiropractor that knows what they're doing. There's absolutely no way anybody's been in our office and seen a baby adjust in our office doesn't look like that. You can barely tell we're doing anything because we're holding on those gentle little tiny bones and facets that are still cartilaginous to release the stress that's been there. Let me just see if I can get to my next slide without poking around too many times here and making this effective as possible. We don't have to watch that again, I promise. But this is often what we'll see when a patient comes into our office. We will see that as a toddler, as somebody up against gravity, that their head has been jammed up and tilted to the side like this because it is being tied and protected from those damages. Your brain and your body never want to further damage an area. So even if you think about just a strain or a sprain of like a shoulder, an elbow, a wrist, a finger, anyone, I'm sure all of you have strained or sprained something where those joints have bent way too far. They shouldn't have done that. There's all sorts of trouble. There's inflammation, there's irritation. You don't want to move that thing because it hurts. You can express it because you're an adult. A baby's just going to cry about that. But that area is swollen and intense. It locks up. And you're asked, of course, to move it and get that thing moving, whether it's a finger or a shoulder, but it doesn't feel good to be able to do it. And you got to wait for those tissues to heal up. Well, in these delicate fibers of the spinal cord, and especially in this brainstem where I have this red organ here being highlighted in this first cervical vertebra, it gets locked here. And we will, not only do we see it in our examination, but we'll see it in our neurological scans on how much stress can get stuck up in that brain, up in that spinal cord. That's the primary relay center of everything from your nervous system. And it's a huge piece of proprioception and balance. It is a huge feedback center. When you're looking at how the brain is getting feedback, it's getting actually fed from those spinal muscles. And they're not moving. They're locked up, jammed up tight, and it's not getting the brain the feedback it needs. If any of you have ever even been to an OT, you'll hear the word proprioception. It means where are you at in time and space, where your brain needs to know that information. It will also perceive that as stress. But there are some huge relay systems in that upper cervical spine, 33%. So 60% of your brain's being fed from those spinal muscles, over half in that upper cervical spine. And this picture is probably a little fuzzy as well, but I can read it to you and what I see on my end. But we also are able to measure that on our neurological scans. And this is a picture of one of our scans of a child, the one I was discussing, who was stuck in fight or flight, having night terrors, unable to go to private school. The normative data is within this gray to green zone. Then we have green is +1, +2, +3, red. And if you follow this black line, this is his pattern of how much stress is up in that upper cervical spine, well, in his nervous system in general, but you can see how much is stuck in that upper cervical spine. This is how he was when he came in. And this was a mom that had done everything she could. She did the OT, she did the PT, she did speech therapy. She had been bringing him to a neurologist. She had removed all toxins from the home. They had a very clean organic diet. She had removed gluten and dairy, all the things. And this kid was still struggling. And she was the mom looking for the why of what's going on in his nervous system. And he had an emergency cesarean section. Thank God it saved his life. But once again, she didn't know how to undo those damages. And when you're looking in this upper cervical spine, so here's how you read this chart. I'm looking at the brain and the spinal cord. I'm looking at all of the organs here that are in control in those areas. And I know you can't read this because it's even blurry in my large end over here. And when there's stress, there are some of the effects that you see. And when you start to read these off, from colic and excessive crying, torticollis, plagocephaly, ear infections, immune system, headaches, migraines, behavior issues, I can't even read all, low energy, difficulty sleeping, anxiety and seizures, ADHD. What else do we have on there? Constipation, reflux, depression. I mean, there's so many things that are up there that we'll see stress. I wish I had that in a larger picture. Maybe I can send it to you guys, that we will see interfered with. And once again, we're always looking at those effects, and we want to go back and look at the cause. Is there stress to this area? If we remove it, how do we maintain that feedback to the brain and get the body to self-heal and self-regulate on its own, the way that it's designed to, which is what I literally remember seeing Landon's first scan, and I wish I had his scan here. And once again, I told you he was a home birth. He came faster than I wanted to. I didn't look at it as traumatic. He had a really clean environment. He was, I feel like, not able to move enough because I would haul him back and forth to work with me and kind of stuck in one of the infant carriers and didn't get that motor movement back to the brain. I mean, those are really important. He was a little bit slower to reach his milestones. And we know that that brain is driven by, it's mostly mechanoreceptor driven, so movement driven. It's fed on that. We know we check motor milestones on kids to see how the brain is developing. Well, that's called proprioception. They weren't getting the right feedback. Landon wasn't getting the right feedback, and a lot of his brain was processing information a lot slower than children of his age. But he was also processing emotions a lot more difficulty. He wasn't able to sleep through the night. All of the things adding up to that fight or flight response, but his brain was also very unorganized, which we also measure on that last scan that we saw here with this little guy. I remember looking at his scans and seeing just how unorganized Landon's brain was and being kind of distraught, but also encouraged at the same time to know that, okay, there's stress that's there. Unfortunately, he's been living with this and doing the best he can because that's what the brain and the body does. But fortunately, you can change. And I am a firm believer of self-healing, self-regulating system in the body. It's going to do it so much better without stress there. It's going to do it so much better through a clean, clear, and effective nervous system. That brain is going to be so much happier. That parasympathetic nervous system is going to work so much better. And yes, when I'm talking, Beth was talking about the foods, he had an aversion to some foods too. But often what I'll see with kids who are stuck in that fight or flight response, they only want sugar to feed their brain because it's just trying to sustain that fight or flight response. It doesn't want to sit down and digest nice crunchy apples and carrots and a salad and digest all these nutrients. No, it wants crackers and cheese and sugar so it can feed it and go. It just wants quick, digestible glucose because that's what the body runs on sympathetic. It runs on the sugar. It'll deplete all the glycogen from the muscle stores before it's going to want to digest a high dense nutrient. And that was some of Landon. Landon was a little bit slow to digest as well. And the foods would constipate him, so it was a little bit harder for us to be able to feed him well. But also he was unable to process a lot of his life very well. I don't know if you guys can see this or not, but this is Landon writing his name after 3 years of preschool and totally not recognizing his name. His motor skills were so far off, which should have been the biggest clue to me that his brain is so far off with processing information. He just couldn't do it. He couldn't sit still to do it. He wasn't learning, and he was very unorganized. I thank God had heard about this sort of care, neurological based care. I had to get advanced training and pediatric training to be able to help Landon, my own son, but my eyes were open to the number of families and children that were struggling, that were just like us, the marriages that were stressed, other children and siblings that didn't understand why this kid couldn't do whatever else the family was. Why he didn't live inside the values of the family, and he got to have meltdowns and not sleep through the night and sleep in mom's bed and not eat the dinner that's in front of him and need a tutor at school. That's a difficult thing for siblings to understand. It's also a lot of stress in a home, a lot of stress on a marriage. I know moms are usually the number one, I'm all about healthcare person and I'm going to make the healthcare decisions. Dads kind of want to protect the cave, and we can have a lot of headbutting in that situation. I know my husband and I did, of like, what are we going to do? What kind of route do we need to take? What kind of parenting approach do we want to take with this? How are we going to tackle this? And the most refreshing thing that I found that we needed to do is to be able to parent a child with a clear nervous system that wasn't feeling stressed. You can't talk to a stressed brain and expect it to absorb everything that you're saying. It just doesn't work. It just doesn't self-regulate. It's not going to be able to hear what you're saying. It's not going to pick up on those cues. It's not going to understand discipline. It might be fearful, especially for an authoritarian parent. It's going to feel a lot more stress and might get fearful of it, but not have that regulation to say, oh, I shouldn't do this. This could have negative consequences because that fight or flight response just doesn't allow the body to do it. And man, this has been a rewarding ride, honestly, to watch children be able to come into their own, to get that clear brain, to see families be able to parent now a child who's processing their environment appropriately is awesome. I'll tell patients all the time, it's not like you're going to get a brand new child. You're going to get the best version of your child. That's possible. And if there's a parenting issue in there, there's a parenting issue in there, right? You're like, my husband's authoritarian and I'm passive. Yeah, there's going to be a little conflict and a child's going to be able to figure that out. But if they are unable to self-heal and self-regulate, if they're unable to process their environment appropriately, if they're unable to focus, typically it's not their fault. And that's usually what I'll tell kids when they come into the office. I'm never talking about their struggles or their problems or what's wrong with them. We talk about how healthy their body can be and what can go right, because there's enough of the world out there to tell them that there's something wrong, that they're different, that this isn't normal. And instead, we want to be on their side, cheering them on to say, you can do this. You can do anything. No one's going to stop you. We're going to get the best version of you. And here you go, world. Look out. You've got the best version of this child possible. And that's when you really start to see the family shine, the stress lifted, and the kid do what they were designed to do. So I hope that this was helpful for you guys. If you're someone that's in my office, you kind of know this story. You might have a family member who's not a part of our office and needs a scan. You want to know what's going on. If you're not a part of our office, when somebody comes into our office, a really complicated case, to get these neurological scans and to sit down with a doctor with an examination is $300. Anybody else, $189. Or non-complicated, I should say. Anybody who's watched any of these webinars, who has a good understanding, or at least a basis, now you hear some of the story and you want to get your child checked, we do it for $100. So I want you to click on that link that's on here, and if I need to copy it into the, hang on a second, I will. That way you can click it. It's also as an offer in the bottom of this webinar. You should get it in links. I'm going to now post it into the comments. And let me just get myself big here. Because we just never know. We check every system in the body and we don't check the nervous system, which is the master control system, and the one that is controlling every other system inside the body, from emotions to eating to digestion to the immune system. We need that thing balanced and we need that thing running optimally. So thank you for watching. I appreciate it. I know that it's a Thursday and the sun is shining and we've had great weather, which I absolutely love. Once again, choose your stress wisely. I choose to go out and get some vitamin D and some movement in my body and some healthy food, which I'm going to do. And I hope you guys have a wonderful evening. Thanks for watching. You're welcome, Patsy.